I think we're going to get going now. Thank you, everybody. Good morning and welcome, almost good afternoon, and welcome to the last panel of Villa La Pietra 2018. I'm Lisa Benenson. I'm losing my voice. Apologies. I have my water. I work for the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU Law. We're a think tank and policy shop where we honor Justice Brennan's vision of a legal system that is rooted in human dignity and the great American values of freedom, equality, democracy, and justice. As we have learned repeatedly over the 200 years of our republic, this is a fight for every generation. And as we've discussed this week, it is a fight today. Perhaps not everyone on this panel will agree with me, but at the Brennan Center, we see this country engaged in a great battle for the future of constitutional democracy. And over the last few weeks, in the face of voter suppression, gerrymandering, broken voting machines, the people have spoken and democracy won. Our government is more diverse than ever, with more women and people of color serving their country in Congress than ever before. It took one night to drop the average age in the House of Representatives by 10 years. And in this election, something new happened, something hopeful. Democracy itself was on the ballot, and voters shouted for change. In Michigan, Missouri, Nevada, Colorado, and Utah, they ended partisan gerrymandering, joining another initiative passed earlier this year in Ohio. In Michigan and Nevada, they became the 14th and 15th states to enact automatic voter registration. In Florida, voters ended an ugly remnant of Jim Crow, agreeing that those who have served their time, more than 1 million of their fellow citizens, should be able to again exercise their right to vote. Because the values of La Pietra and the dialogues have always been about the power of seeking compromise and looking across the aisle, I wanted to talk to all of you, my friends here on this panel today. Given the list of democracy reforms passed by voters in both red and blue states, what lessons should Democratic and Republican leaders take from this in terms of how they approach the next couple of years? And Kevin, why don't I start with you?
You want to answer that question?
I want you to answer that question. Should we take any lessons from this?
Well, I think one of the lessons is just the importance of participation. I think this conference underscores that every single year, the participation from the students in understanding how democracy is not an event, but it is a living, breathing thing that constantly requires attention and cultivation in order to.
And I think that's something that people are sort of learning more and more. I think even with some of the folks who are critics of this president, Stephanie made this point yesterday where they feel like they kind of blew it in 2016, and then their participation levels as a result became that much more, they became that much more involved, and they became that much more animated about their political views and expressing them and promoting them. So I think that's one of the big lessons that we have to constantly learn and constantly be aware of.
Bettina?
I think it's good for democracy having more people involved. I think, a lot of my political views are shaped because my mother came from Cuba, where there's only one political party and people don't have the right really to vote other than the person that has been decided will be the party leader. So I'm very passionate about getting more people involved in the political system. I think it makes a stronger democracy. And I think that everything that makes it possible for people that feel that the government is more transparent and more fair is better. And I advocate for that. So I think it's better for everyone. We live in a time where people have so much access to information. They get, and we're mobilizing people at historic levels. And I think it can only get better. And I'm excited that even though a lot of the gains that we've seen in Congress are on the Democratic side, I think it's great for Republicans as well, because it hires the stakes for both sides to make sure that we have a country that looks like, a government that looks like our country. And that's only good because
I do believe in you have to see it to be it. Like, to get more people involved, they have to have people that look like them. So I think it's a good day for America, and I hope it continues to get that way.
I think there are two lessons that are important for Democrats to take. One is that we are right when it comes to the issues around voter participation. Getting more people to vote is better for our democracy. taking on the fight head on against voter suppression in all its forms is a good fight for us to take on, not just politically, but for the democracy. At the same time, I think we have to look at the parameters of what was a better night for us at the polls than Republicans, by and large. I know some of my colleagues disagree, but be very careful of hubris. Hubris will be our enemy. And if we miss what the message was here, I think by and large it was, you folks better figure out how to work together or you'll pay the price 2 years from now.
You know, ballot initiatives serve a purpose for the elected citizens to kind of step outside their legislature and make change. Sometimes that's good, sometimes it's bad. I think, you know, if you talk to someone in California, the ballot initiatives that have passed and have been in place for decades sometimes limit what state government can do, and it forces them to make really tough and challenges. It gives them tough challenges to face. So I generally think, you know, ballot initiatives are valuable. It always bothers me when wealthy people on either side start putting ballot initiatives on the state. And I also do think there has to be you know, we've talked before about, you know, you can't have democracy without sacrifice. You can't have, with all the rights that we as a country have, we have to have responsibility. So it always does make me a little nervous when we start to tinker with things. You know, election day used to be the country would come together in a grand moment of consensus and make choices. And right now, I always just wonder, in our drive to get more people to vote, are we losing that grand consensus? Meaning, I know of campaigns that something came out about a candidate and, you know, 40% of the people had already voted. I'm not saying participation should be sacrificed for that, but I do wonder if we're having a deep enough thought at the state and federal level about that. And I guess that's an open question for me that I haven't quite resolved.
John, you want to take that one up?
Yeah, in a minute. I'm going to take your knees out on that. No, you know, but you made me think about the fact is that, you know, when there's great dysfunction, and listen, dysfunction's not new, right? I think that we feel like it's heightened because of Trump and because of, you know, now Trump and Pelosi. That's going to be interesting, right? But we kind of we've lived with dysfunction for a long time in DC and in politics. But when there's intense dysfunction, you tend to find that voters will take democracy into their own hands. And maybe the best example this cycle is that there was 4 very conservative states who went to the ballot in initiatives, statewide initiatives, to expand Medicaid. In places like Utah, right, which is a dead bang Republican state, although we've had some victories in places like Utah. My point is that, you know, you shouldn't have to like live in a state with a friendly governor or legislature to expand Medicaid, right? And that's kind of what happens. We have this crazy system where, you know, if you're in Michigan and you have a Republican governor who believes in it, they expand Medicaid and it's great. But if you're, you know, in a state like Florida and your guy doesn't want to do it, you know, you don't get Medicaid expansion. And voters went to the polls and expanded Medicaid in states where their governors wouldn't do it. And that's a good thing, right? And I think that we, you know, probably need more of that. We also saw, just on that issue, as an example, that, you know, people will take democracy in their own hands by voting, right? Naturally. And in places like Michigan and Nevada, where the Republican nominee opposed the Republican sitting governor on Medicaid expansion, the Democrats used that, and those Republicans lost. As a matter of fact, Snyder in Michigan and Sandoval in Nevada would not support or endorse the Republican nominee, Laxalt in Nevada, and Schuette in Michigan. That's huge. I mean, that's a really big deal. And both of those guys opposed their expansion of Medicaid and other things. And so, you know, democracy worked because they went to the polls and voted against them. So, you know, that I think is important. The only other point I would make is that there is this fear, and I actually don't think the GOP should fear easy access to either polling or registration, et cetera. And if there was any example of that, it was actually last Tuesday. I mean, we had record turnout. We thought it was just going to be disproportionately Democrats. We had a lot of victories. But there's really evidence, I think, once we see the voter file, that, for example, the expanded universe in Iowa, I talked about it yesterday, 200,000 more people voted on Election Day 18 than in 14. In Florida, the model was supposed to be 6.9 million voters, and 8-something voted. Both of those places, Republicans won. We don't know in Florida yet, but most of that usually holds. My point being is they've got a leader who actually does a really good job energizing their base and getting their people out. And so, what happens is you get a Republican supermajority legislature in North Carolina. Obama gets out of office. They immediately go in there and they limit the number of early voting sites. They limit the time of voting sites. They don't let college people register in that state, et cetera, and they just limit everything. And I actually think that one, of course, it's wrong in terms of a fairness issue, but if they had early registration or on-site registration, I actually don't think that they would be detrimental to their electoral success, because the fact is that both sides are getting people out at a very high rate. In most places, and certainly places like North Carolina, it would probably benefit them if they just made voting easier.
So Kevin, let me kick this one back to you. So it is an article of faith for Democrats that more voting is better, more participation is better. Is that an article of faith for Republicans, or should it be?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's. I don't look at it as an articles of faith that one party has and the other one doesn't. I think they both want to see people participate, and they both want to reach those voters with their, the conversion message. I think the issue, I think, where some of the parties have some differences is in making sure that every vote is that there's an integrity to each vote, that some votes aren't canceled out by those that are maybe registered illegally, or where there are outside groups that oftentimes organize not with a focus on ballot integrity, but just delivering numbers, as many as they can for registration. I think that's where the difference is. I think I'm a tough person to ask on this, because I sort of have some problems within my own party on this question. So I'll just leave it there, quite frankly.
Bettina?
I'm with Kevin.
Okay, well, let's take a look then at a question that was posed in the description of the panel. I'm curious with all of you what the primary policies are that you think, if there are primary policy issues, that will define us in the lead up, or define our conversation in the lead up to 2020. Are we going to be talking foreign or domestic? Are we going to be talking Mueller or not Mueller? Economy or social and political change? Healthcare, which drove 75% of the Democratic turnout in this election, as opposed to only 23% of the Republican turnout. Which of those issues are most in your party's interest, and which do you see as posing a great risk for your party?
Can I take that?
Go for it.
No, because I think if we're honest with ourselves as Democrats, it is our biggest strength and potentially our biggest vulnerability. If Joel and I are pollsters and we do a lot of focus groups and everyone else sees it, the anxiety level of real people on healthcare is palpable. I mean, most people, it's not just that they're worried about healthcare, they're worried about, can they pay a copay, a deductible, getting their prescription drugs, et cetera. You can put the blame at a lot of places. But you hear this thing, people are one illness away from bankruptcy. It's the leading cause of bankruptcy. People put their health costs on their credit cards. So it really is the dominant issue for people. And it's not just health care, it's dental care, it's mental health care. I mean, it's real, okay? So it's a Democrat, Republican, independent issue. So I think that it is a dominant issue. I think that you saw, for example, again, I use Michigan in Nevada. Medicaid expansion was one of the primary issues that we used. In Iowa, even though the Democrat lost, kept the Republican, did 11 points better than the Democrat 4 years ago. And the number one issue was Medicaid privatization, right? I mean, Medicaid privatization, I mean, people know about it. It was important to people. And so I think that Democrats have a natural advantage. You saw almost every campaign talking about pre-existing conditions. You saw Republicans on the defensive and then having to run commercials saying, no, I'm not for taking away the protections. So it will be a key issue. And it could be a real vulnerability in the Democratic primary where there's potentially this litmus test to go to a single-payer system, a government-run system that'll cost a lot. The Democrats or the Republicans will use that to say it's going to be $32 billion in taxes. And I think that it's a trap because, the fact is that for Democrats, I'm hoping there's Democrats who will sit there and say, let's talk about the realm of possibility and what we can do. And why isn't anyone talking about, improving upon Obamacare, fixing Obama? We've forgotten that Obamacare actually, until they stripped a bunch of stuff away, was working and really helping people. And the fact is that, there's no way there's going to be a single-payer system with this president. And we should be talking about the things that we can actually do in the realm of possibility.
I'm going to jump in and piggyback before we turn it over to our colleagues on the other side. I believe that there should be some investigations that would be legitimate territory for the House to undertake. What I'm worried about, and that's what I meant by hubris being our biggest challenge, I think if we overreach on that, we are going to lose sight of what really took place in this election. So, for example, you might want to subpoena Donald Trump's tax returns, but I would also say the Democrats in the House ought to pass a law requiring presidents and presidential candidates to release a certain number of years of their tax returns. There's no reason. It had been the custom up until Donald Trump ran for president. Everybody did it. Mitt Romney did it, who was probably really wealthier than Donald Trump, by the way, just to tweak Trump a little bit. But that had been a custom, and we ought to actually enshrine that in law. There's no reason we should be debating whether or not we see a president's tax returns, and every president has done it, even without a law. But I'd love to see the House pass that and put it in the lap of the Republican Senate, and not just for politics, but I think to also set a precedent that there's going to be a certain amount of ethics that presidents have to live up to at a minimum level, and your tax returns is one of them. I worry about overreach of the investigations and losing sight of what Anzo just had. I think if Democrats read this wrong, I think looking around some of the things that happened in red states where we made some gains and why, I think we will hopefully focus on some of the issues that Anzo said. And I think healthcare is one of them. I think doing something on minimum wage ballot initiatives passed, and also several purple to red states. People, as I said yesterday, their wages stagnating are still one of the biggest problems they have. And we ought to do something that will help drive up the pay of working people.
Rob, you want to pick this up? Policy issues.
Sure.
Can we talk policy between now and 2020?
Yeah, of course we will. I think 2020, someone said a very wise statement yesterday, which is too many times we frame up future elections with the past election. I think with regards to healthcare, Republicans and the elections, the Republicans had a pretty good night. To put the fear of God into this panel, I would say it's kind of similar to Reagan's first midterm, where he lost 24 House seats and picked up a Senate seat and went on to win every state except for Minnesota and District of Columbia. That's for Joel, just to make sure he's awake down there.
Yeah, well, I don't remember that.
You're too young. But Republicans are already analyzing. Rove had a big speech about the losses in the suburbs. McConnell's highlighted the fact that we don't really have an Act Blue counterpart on the right. And House Republicans met last week, and the first item up for discussion was we need to fix this pre-existing condition problem that got exposed by the Democrats. So my guess is you'll see a fix, either rhetorically or actually policy-wise, that someone can point to and say, see, we fixed that. So the question is on health care. I think we are going to have a health care debate. And Democrats are trusted more with regards to the subject of health care in general when you look at the public opinion. However, there are two things I keep hearing that don't worry me that much as a 2020 look-ahead strategist. One, healthcare. If they want to talk about healthcare costs, Republicans are very comfortable talking about that. Obamacare was never about cost, it was about access. So Obama comes into the office 2008, economy, great collapse. Everyone said, fix the economy, fix the economy. He said, no, let's talk about healthcare. And they said, no, we don't want to talk about healthcare, let's talk about the economy. He said, no, we're going to talk about healthcare. Fine, fix the cost of the healthcare. He said, no, we're going to talk about access. So the great, amazing thing about the ACA was that it got done, even though American people wasn't addressing their primary concerns. And so if we want to have a national debate about cost of healthcare, let's have that. I think our people are pretty comfortable. And minimum wage, Tom Cotton's for minimum wage increase. If we want to do it at the state level, our candidates, our people are pretty used to talking about minimum wage. I think we've always had a pretty good answer. I don't see that becoming a national issue. And with regards to investigations, I think there's two driving factors. The donors on the left, and we had the same problem with Obama. Donors on the left invested a lot of money in this majority, and they want an ROI, and their ROI is they want to see Trump investigated. Yesterday, I think Schiff announced that it was going to be an indictment cannon, like a T-shirt cannon at a game, and so they're loading up. They said the list of people was over 90 Trump people are going to be subpoenaed or indicted. So the donors seemingly from these districts are getting what they wanted, and Joel's desire for an economic and healthcare-based solution coming out of the House is kind of fading to the background. I think there's a couple things that you have to wrestle with. Pelosi's a very precarious spot, so she's got to play into her base hard, into her liberal base. If that's what they want, she won't have a lot of power in the beginning until she's speaker. Remember, the speaker vote isn't until January, so she's in this very precarious spot for a very long time. And to be speaker, you have to get a majority of the House. And so when Trump said we might give her some Republican votes, which would never happen, but imagine the primary. You're like, oh, I'm a good Republican when you voted for Pelosi. I could, from this seat, I could win a primary in Tennessee. I wouldn't have to go there. But it just shows you. So I think the shiny ball that the Democrat leadership has to have is the power of the subpoena, and we're going to torment Trump. And then maybe in May or something they can have kind of an agenda. But I think that's the challenge, and I think that's the precursor to what the 2020s are going to have to wrestle with. Presidential candidates, I'm sorry, 2020 presidential candidates.
So far this panel sounds that like they all believe one way or the other we're going to be very focused on domestic issues, not foreign issues. Bettina, where do you see
No,
this?
I agree. I think at the end of the day, I think most of us would agree. When people vote, they vote for their self-interest. They're worried about kitchen table issues, and we see it in election after election. I think you'll see national security. I think Trump will talk a lot about promises made, promises kept, which is a campaign slogan he's already started. There's a website about it. And he'll talk about North Korea, he'll talk about his trade agreements, but all of that will play at home, like how that affects you at home with your family and your kids. And people, we have to put our self-interest first.
The national security question and foreign policy question and how it plays in 2020 is a tough one to always answer, because national security and foreign policy politics are never driven by trends. It's always driven by events. And so we don't know what could happen. I mean, we could be having this think about the conversations we were all having on September 10th. Of 2001 about immigration being a big issue to discuss, and immigration reform and whether it was possible. One day later, we were the politics and the landscape and the issue landscape was all transformed. So we don't know yet. And one of the things that Trump uses to his advantage is when these events happen or these moments are litigated on foreign policy and national security, he has a very he has a talent for understanding that the American people oftentimes react on those issues less about policy details and more about attributes. And he speaks with a strength and a clarity and a sense of purpose on national security and foreign policy. Even if you disagree with him, you have to admit that he really does break through a lot of the clutter. And that was one of the huge challenges that Secretary Clinton had, which is that as somebody who worked in foreign policy and was Secretary of State, she understood there were really important details and nuance that needed to be threaded if you're going to get some of those policies right, but which makes really bad politics, and oftentimes made her look indecisive or weak, or played into this idea that she was more interested in foreign opinion in capitals around the globe than she was about whether or not people in Columbus, Ohio, what they felt. So that was that's something that we'll have to see, and it'll be interesting on whether or not on those debates, national security, foreign policy, whether or not the fundamentals are altered so that they're that it has an impact in 2020 and come election time, or if it's just the atmospherics, which is that we argue about these things, Trump tweets about them for a little while, and then they sort of fall back, and domestic concerns once again really drive and shape voter attitudes.
Can I just add one thing that I think in the next few years could be an issue? It's an international issue, which is a domestic issue, which is trade. Because these trade tariffs, it takes time to kick in. The economic impact, positive or negative, takes time. I mean, there's soybeans like piling up in silos right now because these farmers can't sell them, and it's a problem. And I don't know if that becomes igniting at some point at a much deeper level than it was previously, because people just didn't know how it was going to impact them.
Look, I think one of the panels yesterday talked about how trade didn't really have that much of an impact, or but it did in some. So with trade, you don't really boil the ocean. In many of these districts, like take for example Iowa 1. Some of the polling out there, the publicly available polling showed that while everybody else believed the economy was booming, that a lot of people in that district felt that they had a worse off economic situation than before Trump was elected because of tariffs, whether it was on steel or aluminum, or some of the hangover from on the ag community in that district. So and the other thing is, as we all know, we see this in polling. Economic attitudes they're freightliners. They do not turn on a dime. They take about 4 to 6 months, attitudes about the economy, to change. And if you look at when Trump started the trade war with a tweet that said trade wars are good, they're easy, and we can win them, that was March 2nd. It was my birthday. It was March 2nd. And happy birthday to Mr. Pro Trade Kevin. We're going to start a trade war. And but they didn't start being implemented until somewhere in June. And that was when, if you look at some of these attitudes about the economy, even though we're seeing great economic numbers, some attitudes were starting to soften in some of these areas that are being hit. So I think it's a big issue for the next year. Bettina mentioned Trump's trade deals, which was changing the font on NAFTA and renaming it, changing and actually making it a more democratic like trade deal, and with rules of origin and all sorts of workers' wage standards. But the interesting thing is now is whether or not Democrats with a more Democrat-like pact will support it. And I think that's going to be tough, because many of those Democrats up on Capitol Hill just simply, while they may agree with maybe some of the policy details in USMCA, they just don't want to give Trump a win. And the politics of building the coalitions, trade deals are really, really hard to get done, even when you have White Houses and Congress working well together, bought in on the policy, familiar with the details. And you're missing a lot of those elements right now.
But Trump doesn't want, you say Democrats don't want to give Trump a win, but the reality is this is one issue which allows Republicans to actually stand up to the guy, and they won't do it on this issue.
No,
and they're free traders. They were free traders. They were free traders.
Right.
But
Go ahead. Can I jump in with one other thing quickly on this that we haven't mentioned? Because it is a domestic issue. No one's mentioned the deficit, which Republicans used to like to talk about.
I was actually going to have it. I have my notes right here. Spending deficit.
Deficit spending.
I was going to bring that
This
up.
deficit is going to keep growing, and if it keeps growing, there could be economic consequences that we can't anticipate yet. because it's not going to come down by 2020 based on the tax cuts. So how that plays, I think, over the next 2 years is going to be critically important for both sides, because they're going to have to find a way to deal with it, and I'm not confident that either side has a way out of it.
The way they're going to deal with it is blame a Democratic Congress.
Who didn't pass the tax
Well,
cuts?
one of the problems Democrats have on trade too is that their constituencies right now, if you poll publicly, Democratic voters are in support of freer trade, but their elected officials are in no mood to advance those type of policies. So it's interesting, and yeah, it'll be interesting to see whether or not we see Republicans all of a sudden become fiscal conservatives again. After 2 years of not really having that as a top priority.
So, depending on how Democrats are going to run against President Trump, Joel Benenson, who has promised his wife that he will not be doing another presidential campaign.
Yeah, right.
So I'd like you to get your ideas out on the floor now and then put them in a suitcase.
Say the question again. I got so distracted when you brought up our marriage.
So, since you won't be advising a presidential candidate, what would you like to tell Democratic candidates out there right now looking at how they're going to run against Trump, given what we've heard at this table?
I think the first thing I would tell any Democratic candidate is don't take this lightly. I mean, he has demonstrated a certain skill to not just dominate the media, but to knock people off their game. And I would also tell them not to play his game. I think to the extent that people are alienated by his style, which probably, are not the people in his base, but I think a lot of swing voters are. We tend to be a pretty modest, moderate country. We still have roots somewhere in our Puritan ethic, and he's over the top. I think I would I would start advising people like, own your own style. Don't get caught up in what you think are the optics and the fireworks of every day. Make sure you have your North Star about why you want to be president. Make sure you have less than a handful of issues that are going to animate that rationale for your presidency, and stay focused on those. I would also say that it will be very easy to draw a contrast with President Trump on substantive issues, and pick those carefully where he's in territory he's not comfortable with and territory that he can't defend.
So I'm going to turn this now to John Anzalone, who may be going to work for a presidential candidate.
Talk to Wendy. No, I think that, and Joel and I lived this in 2016. Don't fall into the trap of defining your Democratic presidential campaign on your opponent's behavior. Right? I mean, the fact is everyone knows about his behavior, and don't do the, he's an embarrassment in Europe. No, that's not a message, The fact is that drive a message about what is impactful in people's lives, and how what the other guy or party is doing is not looking out for them. And I think that is really key. Again, we probably wanted to drive a more economic message, and that didn't happen. And it was all about the guy's behavior, which is, guess what? Built into the cake, or built into the cake? Baked into the cake. Thank you.
Built into the stock.
Something like that. Baked into the cake, and so we kind of all know it. So don't do that. And second is, guess what? He has a base out there of real America that someone was talking about before. Is one, kind of like, he doesn't really mean it. They will put up with his behavior because they like certain things about him, and they believe that he's the guy that's speaking for them. So talk about impactful things around their kitchen table, and I think that is the answer. And again, I will talk about this a lot in the next couple of years. Screw the litmus tests, okay? Yeah. Voters don't. What we found out in the primary election is people want Democratic candidates who are progressive enough. You're pro-choice, you're pro-gay rights, you're pro-gun control. People aren't dying for you to be, boycotting Israel and being for single payer. Right. I mean, don't get caught in these litmus tests that makes you have to come out against ICE. I mean, it's freaking ridiculous. Talk about things that are impactful to people.
One word I'll also add, because it is an issue that Democrats, I think, can own going forward, is education. And I'm not talking about free college, I'm talking about public education from K up, and we should own them.
And skills training.
Yep.
So I have a question from our three Republican colleagues at the table here. First, you should weigh in on this as you wish, but I also wanted you specifically to talk a little bit about the notion that in presidential politics, we look at races and we try to figure out whether we are going to look for the replica or the remedy. I am curious which kind of candidate you think Democrats, if they want to win, should be looking for, getting free advice out of Republican colleagues. Give me a description of the Democrats' winning candidate. Rob?
I'm usually pretty good picking conservative or Republican primaries. Democrats, I'm not as good, obviously. I would say there's probably three categories I would put it into. One is there's the Bernie Sanders primary that he may be a part of, or you could see Kamala Harris and Cory Booker. They seem to be all kind of competing for that. He came out with his agenda, they kind of adopted it, and I think there's going to be a struggle to see who can emerge from that crowd. I think that's the hard left, angry left, the people who want impeachment and other stuff, and a very progressive agenda. I think I don't know how they get funded or where their energy comes from, but I think there's kind of the governors, Hickenlooper, there's some other people who I think folks would hear say maybe, they're not exciting, but if you believe the country always elects the opposite of what we have in the White House, so you got W, you get Obama, you get Trump, kind of different styles. Maybe the country will be ready for a little just like, I know how to govern, like I'm not very flashy, I'm on Twitter, like I just kind of will show up and do the job. And then I think there's the wild cards, like a Michael Bloomberg, because he has a record, it's not a starkly partisan, so he doesn't fit in the Bernie Sanders crowd. He's not a governor who, I manage the state, so I'm ready for a promotion, but he managed arguably the most important city in America. What I thought was interesting is he re-entered politics after a hiatus, and I thought he did it pretty well. We've seen other political dynasties re-enter politics, and sometimes it's bumpy, and the party they left isn't the party that they come back to. And I think his re-entry was pretty good. His team seemed to, be able to have a good night. I'd be curious if my colleagues share it. I feel like if you're looking at the oligarchs who are putting money into politics, he had a better night than Steyer, and I just think he has a deftness and a seriousness. He has enough that I think he could appeal to a part of the Republican Party and kind of those last decider swing voters in certain key states. The question is, can he survive the primary? It's going to be a big primary, and I think it's going to be a very left-leaning primary because I think that's where the energy and the money is.
Yeah. Tina and Kevin?
Well, I asked my friends on Facebook, I'm like, who do you think is going to run? I have a list of like 24 people on the Democratic side. I'm like, and there was like an article that came out, like Hillary Clinton is thinking of a third term. I'm like, yes, let's do it. To your earlier point, it's like, I'm not sure, like I'm not an expert in Democrats, but Trump is a master at baiting people into political suicide. And I think, the panel before was about the media, and I think one of the problems with the media is like they've taken a lot of this personally, and I think it's become an ego thing with some reporters and Trump. And I think with a lot of these people running as Democrats, I think their ego is going to get sometimes the best of them, and they're not going to focus on their message. And I think after these midterm elections, Trump's possibility of re-election went up with Pelosi there in the House. I do think so. So I'm like, I would love Hillary Clinton. I would love, I think Cory Booker is interesting, but also sometimes his ego gets the best of him in certain aspects. So I don't know, I could read this list of 24 people, but.
So I'm actually less interested in names than in types, in the type of person. Kevin, maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Well, I thought a lot about this, and I've talked to a lot of my Democratic friends about this, and they haven't come up with the name really that sort of matches it. But here's what I think. It has to be somebody who is at their core, the one thing that really stands out is that they are optimistic. And this is a sort of criticism I have of Democrats in their failure to appeal to a lot of Republicans right now that are nose holders or very disaffected Republicans. But the Democrats right now, I think, one of the big challenges that they have is that they try to win over their own converted by offering and articulating what it means to be a Democrat by how much they think conservatives are wrong or what's wrong with them. So it's always through the lens of the critique of the other party, rather than having a very confident, very aspirational, very optimistic view of where they want to go. And they are obsessed with Trump. And they're doing it all the way through Trump and Trump's voters, and then they are applying, oftentimes, what they see are his worst attributes to all Republicans, and there are a lot out there that are disaffected. So that's one of the things that I think is important, is that they find somebody who is optimistic and that they can unite the party. And here's the other thing: is I remember in the '04 re-elect, when I was working for then President Bush, when we went out and offered a contrast message every single day against John Kerry, very rarely, very, very rarely did the president ever mention the term Senator Kerry. He would just say, my opponent. And one of the things that was most important about that, and Nicole Wallace drilled it into my head every single day as I was serving as the president's voice and face sometimes, was that our opponents are not evil, they're wrong. And we disagree with them, and we're providing an alternative vision for the country. And that is where we have to focus our message. So we would constantly say, we happen to disagree with Senator Kerry on this. We think that's the wrong approach. Here's what President Bush is articulating and why it's the right approach for America. And that is a very important distinction I think many Democrats miss right now. The last thing I would say is what I think is actually might be more important is the tempo of a campaign. One of the things that struck me was how many times I run into Democrats during the Republican primary in 2016. They're like, oh man, we want Trump. And I'm like, no, you do not. He is an asymmetrical boxer. You never know what he's going to do next. And that is something that is inherently important in campaigns, is that the campaign that wins is always the campaign that's on offense. It's always the campaign that is dictating the tone and tempo of the campaign. And in this race, in 2016, Hillary Clinton was always responding to Trump. Trump drove and shaped the narrative and the terms of the debate every single day. So when whoever the Democrats nominate in order to beat Trump, they have to be somebody who is going to go toe to toe. And this is where I might disagree a little bit with Joel. I think it's important. I think I agree with you on how you do it, but they have to be somebody who every single day is taking it to their opponent and managing and driving the 4 to 5 news cycles that he creates per day. Otherwise, the headlines are all going to be written by Trump. And so I think somebody has to really have a very up-tempo, aggressive campaign if they're going to beat him. It can't be somebody who's like, hey, we're not going to play his game.
Yeah. And I think to his point, they have to have a clear vision. I think one of the issues with Hillary Clinton was she was so smart and so intelligent, had so many great policy issues, but it was very hard to comprehend, what does it mean to me? So you might not like Trump, but most Americans understood a message of make America great again. And they internalize it. It's like make America great again for me. Mm-hmm. And that I'm with her or stronger together. It was, what does that mean to me? So you're going to need a Democrat who has a very clear vision that's very easily to understand for people. Because if not, Trump, they called him the blue-collar millionaire. He just connected with people, and they made them feel like he understood them. And Hillary Clinton just did not have that connection.
So we have, I think, we're running a little bit over, but Ellen told me I could go until 1. So I'd love to take some questions from the audience before we break.
So looking forward to 2020, I think that a number of the panelists over the past couple of days have highlighted just really how close the margins are. And so with that in mind, I think that an issue that was touched on in this panel, but I think really has the potential to just kind of play with the votes at those margins, is the tariffs and the ultimate trade war we find ourselves in. Mr. Anzalone, you highlighted, soybeans piling up in silos. I think we could talk about Maine lobsters piling up in docks in New England. And so with that in mind, I think what is the, we can talk about whether the economic effects are really things that are going to be felt until going into next year. A lot of these farmers have actually sold a lot of their crops going into this year. What is the messaging that ultimately gets those voters to sort of realized the the economic effects, or at least what's happening. Because I think to this point, it's something that Trump's kind of been able to sell to them. He's been able to sell it as it's me going after predatory trade practices by other countries, and especially with the aid package released earlier this year, I think it's something that he's been able to sell to this point, at least through the midterms. But I'd be curious to know what you guys think ultimately gets those effects to be realized going into 2020.
There's a trade question about kind of how the trade wars are going to impact the election.
Yes.
In general. I think there's a couple things on the Republican side. The polling I've seen, which was more corporate polling, so it's a little different, but is that the reason why the Republicans, I describe it as a short but wide leash Trump has on trade. And I thought the midterms would provide clarity, and because it was kind of a mixed bag for the Republicans, I don't think it has. They're waiting to see the impact of the trade war, but their people, the Republican base, is saying give Trump room to maneuver. What I've seen is especially with the farm community, and they're the most sensitive, and that's why Trump put $12 billion into an account to try and buy a little more time there, is they know the deal they have, and they believe Trump can get them a better deal. Now, if the election had been a blowout, I think you would have seen, senators going to the White House saying, let's let the tax cuts work, let's get out of these trade wars, let's stabilize the markets, let's cool it on the interest rate increases if we can, and just hope the economy rockets us to a re-elect for everybody. But because we had kind of a mixed bag, I think Trump's next check is going to be his re-election, and I think trade candidly will be the driver, because if he's successful and actually is perceived by the American people to have had a win on trade, that probably, combined with tax cuts, will give him a case to go back and get reelected, and presidents have a pretty good track record of getting reelected in America. So I think it's a big wild card. And the Republicans are extremely anxious, especially in the Senate. And you've seen some of that bubble up into Rob Portman from Ohio has a bill with, and it doesn't address the trade war that Trump is in, because presidents have a lot of authority in this area. But it's kind of a measure of their disapproval, and it's not going to be passed in the lame duck in December. But you're starting to see a coalescing of people who are getting anxious about trade. So Trump has a sales job to do, both obviously now with the Democratic House, but the Senate Republicans, like I said, they're giving him a lot of room right now, but that leash isn't super long. So I think that in the next year, I think we'll have a lot more clarity.
So Joel or Anzo, give me your 30-second Democratic response so we can take one more question.
Yeah, no, I agree with a lot of what Rob was saying. The interesting thing about Iowa, Indiana, when we did research there, is that you'd think because it's agricultural based, there'd be this huge opposition to the trades, and it's not. I mean, it's very, in between. Again, you have a place like Iowa, it's really corporate farming now. People are sympathetic to agriculture, but it's not their end-all and be-all issue. But a lot of times issues have a two-step process. And until there's an economic impact, right? I mean, you kind of visualize it, you're for it, against it. Strange example, in 2016, McCrory in North Carolina didn't get in trouble on HB2, which was the gender bathroom thing, until voters felt there was an economic impact that was hurting them. And I think that's what we're waiting to see in some of these states, is whether there's going to be an economic impact, and it'll hurt Republicans.
All right, this is a lightning question. Who has a lightning question? Back in the suit jacket. You were at my table this morning.
Model Republicans gone after the midterm election? Are they extinct? And if I may, please, thank you. Mark Penn just recently on the Wall Street Journal says Hillary Clinton in 2020 is a possibility. Any thoughts on that? Is she not politically
Is there
dead?
a loophole in the marriage contract? Is there a loophole? Is there a loophole, sir?
I'm going to let Joel start that one.
I don't think there are a whole lot of Democrats listening to Mark Penn about who should be running for president on the Democratic side after he spent the previous 2 weeks cozying up to Trump. I think he's trying to find a way into somebody's campaign for president.
And our moderates, no. We had a rough night in the suburbs, and we got to work on that. But there's plenty of moderates in the House, the Senate, and I think there are probably more robust moderate caucus in the House Republicans than there's Democratic caucus right now, and all things change. But I think we're very sensitive to that, and it seems like there's a party conversation occurring about moderate and suburban voters.
So I have to wrap this up, but I want to take just a moment to thank Ellen Toscano for the amazing I hope you all understand from seeing all of us here together that the years that she and the wonderful staff here at Villa La Pietra and at NYU, the years and the time they have given us to have these conversations across the political divide have been fruitful. Go back with us to the United States, and I think all of us hope that those friendships will make a difference as we move forward in America. Thank you so much for being here.